The wind cut across the plains like a blade as the rancher finished locking the barn for the night. He hadn't spoken to anyone all day, and that suited him just fine. Silence had become his companion ever since the ranch house started echoing with memories instead of voices. As he turned toward the porch, he noticed a figure standing near the fence, half hidden by the shadows. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but then the figure moved. She stepped forward slowly, her coat too thin for the cold, a small suitcase clenched in her hand like it was the only thing tethering her to the world. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed red, hair loose and tangled by the wind. When she spoke, her voice shook, not from the cold alone, but from something deeper. "I have nowhere else to go." The rancher hesitated. He wasn't a man who welcomed surprises, especially not ones that arrived after dark. He had agreed to the mail order arrangement months ago out of practicality, not hope. He expected a letter, maybe a scheduled arrival in town. Not a woman standing at his fence looking like she'd walked straight out of a bad dream. Still, he opened the gate and motioned her inside without a word. Inside the house, the warmth made her sway, and he caught her elbow just in time. She apologized too quickly, like she was used to being a burden. He set her down at the table, poured her a cup of coffee, and watched her hands tremble as she wrapped them around the mug. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. She explained in fragments. The man she was supposed to marry had never shown. The town boarding house had turned her away when she couldn't pay for another night. People stared, whispered, judged. By the time she found his ranch, the sun was already sinking. "Only need one night," she said softly. "I'll leave in the morning." He studied her face, noticing the fear she tried to hide behind politeness. He thought of the empty guest room, the untouched bed, the loneliness that waited for him every night. Offering shelter for one night felt safe, temporary, controlled, so he nodded and told her she could stay. As she disappeared down the hallway, the rancher stood alone in the kitchen, uneasy in a way he hadn't felt in years. He told himself it was just for one night, but deep down, he sensed that by opening his door, he had already changed something neither of them was ready to name. Morning came quietly, the kind of quiet that settled deep into the bones of the ranch. The rancher woke before dawn out of habit, expecting the familiar emptiness of the house. For a moment, he forgot she was there. Then he heard the soft clink of a cup against a saucer from the kitchen, and the memory rushed back like a held breath finally released. She stood at the stove when he entered. Sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back with a ribbon he didn't remember seeing the night before. The scent of coffee and something warm, eggs maybe, filled the room. She turned quickly, worry flashing across her face as if she feared she'd overstepped. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I wanted to thank you before I leave." The word leave landed heavier than he expected. He nodded, taking a seat, watching her move with careful restraint, like someone used to measuring every step. Over breakfast, she spoke more freely than the night before. She told him about the letters that had promised security and kindness, about selling the few things she owned to afford the journey, about arriving with hope and finding herself invisible. Her voice never rose, but every word carried quiet disappointment. He listened, surprised by how easily the silence between them softened. When she finished, she folded her hands and looked down. "I'll head back to town once the sun's higher," she said. "I can find work somewhere. I always do." He cleared his throat, staring at the worn grain of the table. The idea of her walking back into that town, alone, unwanted, tightened something in his chest. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility. He had already done enough. Yet when he spoke, the words came out differently than planned. "The ranch could use some help," he said slowly. Just for a few days, until you get on your feet." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with disbelief. "You're serious?" He nodded. "You can stay in the guest room. No expectations. No promises." Relief crossed her face so quickly it almost looked like pain. She agreed at once, then seemed to catch herself, apologizing again for being grateful. He shook his head, uncomfortable with how much it mattered to him that she stayed. Later, he showed her around the ranch, the barn, the fields stretching endlessly toward the horizon, the place where the land dipped low enough to watch the sun rise. She walked beside him, listening, asking careful questions, her presence filling the spaces he hadn't realized were empty. By nightfall, she stood on the porch looking out over the land, the wind lifting her hair. She wasn't just a guest anymore. And as the rancher watched her silhouette against the fading light, he knew this arrangement, temporary as it was meant to be, was already becoming something neither of them could easily walk away from. The rhythm of the ranch settled around her faster than either of them expected. By the third morning, she was already awake when the rancher stepped outside, the sky just beginning to pale at the edges. She stood near the corral, feeding the horses with a quiet confidence that surprised. There was a steadiness in her movements now, as if the land itself had begun to claim her. They spoke more during the day, though neither pushed too hard. She asked about the ranch, about how long he'd worked the land alone. He answered simply, leaving out the parts that still hurt. In return, she shared pieces of her past in careful doses, jobs she'd taken and lost, places she'd slept where the door never quite felt secure, the letters that had felt like a promise written just for her. Each confession built a fragile bridge of trust between them. By afternoon, clouds rolled in low and heavy, and the wind shifted, sharp and uneasy. He was fixing a loose fence when the storm broke, rain slashing down hard enough to blur the horizon. She ran toward the barn, slipping in the mud. Without thinking, he grabbed her arm and pulled her under the overhang. For a moment, they stood too close, breath mingling, rain pounding the roof above them. She laughed softly, surprised by the sound, and something in his chest loosened. That night, the power went out. The house fell into darkness, lit only by a single lantern he set on the table. Shadows danced across the walls as they ate in near silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely louder than the wind outside. "I know I said I'd leave when I could," she said, "but I don't want to be a burden." He met her eyes, seeing fear there, not of him, but of being sent away again. "You're not," he said, firmer than he felt. "This place, it's been empty a long time." Her breath caught at his words. The lantern flickered, and for a heartbeat, everything felt suspended. Past regrets, future worries, all of it held at bay. She reached for her cup, and their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it echoed through him like a promise. Later, as she headed toward the guest room, she paused in the hallway. "Thank you," she said, not just for the shelter, but for the way he looked at her now, as someone who belonged somewhere. He stood alone after she closed the door, listening to the storm fade into the distance. He had offered her a place to stay, nothing more. Yet as the ranch settled back into silence, he realized the loneliness he'd lived with for years was finally beginning to loosen its grip. And that scared him almost as much as it gave him hope. The storm left the land washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and promise. Sunlight spilled across the fields the next morning, catching on the fence wire and turning every drop of water into something bright. The rancher watched her from the porch as she stepped outside, pausing like she was taking in the sight not just with her eyes, but with her heart. She smiled then, small, genuine, and it struck him how rarely he'd seen that expression on anyone in years. Work that day felt lighter. They moved around each other with an ease that hadn't been there before, passing tools, finishing each other's tasks without speaking. At midday, he showed her the old apple tree near the creek, its branches still bare but stubbornly alive. He told her his wife used to sit there in the spring, believing the tree would bloom again no matter how harsh the winter had been. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in a long time. Saying it now didn't break him the way he expected. She listened without interrupting, her presence steady. "I've loved this place," she said softly. "As she did," he replied. "I think that's why I stayed." That evening, a rider appeared at the edge of the property, dust rising behind him. The rancher's body tensed before the man even reached the gate. It was the one she had been promised to, the man whose letters had brought her here and then abandoned her without a word. His voice carried accusation, entitlement, as if she were something he'd misplaced rather than a person who'd been left alone in a strange town. She stood beside the rancher, shoulders squared, fear flickering but not overtaking her. Before he could speak, she did. She told the man she wasn't waiting anymore, that whatever agreement he thought existed had died the moment he failed to show. Her voice shook, but she didn't step back. The man scoffed, muttered something bitter, then turned and rode away, taking the last shadow of her old fear with him. Afterward, neither of them spoke for a long moment. The rancher finally exhaled, realizing how close he'd come to losing her without ever admitting he wanted her to stay. "You don't have to decide anything now," he said. "But if you choose to stay, it wouldn't be just out of necessity." She looked at him then, really looked, and nodded slowly, I choose to stay, she said. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this feels like home. As the sun dipped low, casting long golden lines across the land, the ranch no longer felt like a place of waiting. For the first time in years, it felt like a beginning.